Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome to the Wisdom of Dr. Ben Hamer. We live in an increasingly complex world, socially, politically, commercially, and we need deeper levels of leadership today. We need a renaissance of wisdom. We live in an impatient, intolerant world where people are looking for tips, tricks, hacks, and shortcuts. And at the same time, people are trying to peer into the future and predict what will happen. And Ben is an accredited futurist. Ben, I have to ask you what that means in a minute. But you were formerly the head of the future of work at PwC Australia. You recently won the award for the future of work in the Asia Pacific region, held a number of chairs, sat in the World Economic Forum, a whole lot of interesting things in your bio which people can find out about in the show notes. But maybe the best way for us to introduce you to the listeners is for you to tell me why you think business strategy is often based on a flawed idea or a flawed set of principles. Why is business strategy flawed? Let's start with that as your bio.
Yeah, let's start with something a little bit provocative. So, look, I think traditional business strategy is flawed because of the context that you set at the start there, Simon. So, I often say that we're currently experiencing change at the fastest rate in human history, but also the slowest that we'll experience for the rest of our lives. So if things feel like they're moving fast, well, they're only going to get quicker and faster. And so with the world being so volatile, with it changing so much, the way we think about strategy needs to change, because the way that a lot of companies still approach strategy is they kind of look at the last few years and take historical data and then project that forwards. But that assumes this sort of stable set of criteria and assumptions. But with things being so quick to change and shift and adapt, I mean, we didn't think that a pandemic was going to come along necessarily when it did. Organizations need to be able to pivot with that. And so as a futurist, what we do is we practice what's called foresight. So that's kind of looking at all the trends that we're seeing around the world today, extrapolating that into, say, 10 years' time. So signals of change for today that paint a picture of how the world could be different in 10 years' time. And then we start to say, okay, well, is that the kind of future we want? Is it the kind of future we don't want? How do we work towards sort of that desired future state? And then the process of backcasting, which is how we get there. So it's not too dissimilar from traditional business strategy, but really instead of starting with sort of the past and projecting it forward and then pushing it into the future, the 10-year time frame is sort of where we want to start. And again, that's a little bit different because strategy tends to look at 3 to 5 years, whereas we want to try and what is the North Star at that 10-year mark, noting that we want to then plan for scenarios as well, so that between now and then, when our set of assumptions shift, that we as an organization need to be able to shift our business model, our operating model, our workforce model, whatever it might be.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. There's so many things to unpack there. And I do want to come back to the question of what is an accredited futurist, but let's just there's some things that you said that were super interesting. I mean, I have a lot of conversations with people about the 3 lines of sight that are time-based. Time is the great equalizer. It compounds everything and it always wins, right? A year is a year. But hindsight, the benefit of looking into the past, why do you do that? Just to get the lessons and leave all the baggage behind. Insight, what are we acting on right now? But then, of course, as you said, foresight. And it's interesting. I had an opportunity many years ago to go on a drive through the Australian bush with a 10 times Australian rally champion in a rally car. And first of all, he let me drive it at the fastest speed I could. And it was not fast. I was doing 90 to 100 kilometers an hour through these bends. And then he was doing the same drive at about 140, 150 kilometers an hour. And I said, what's the difference? He said, the difference is you're looking at everything from 50 meters out back towards the car. He said, I don't care about that. That's already happened at the speed we're traveling at. I'm looking at the 50-meter mark ahead out to 100.
Yeah, right.
And I'm driving to between 50 and 100 meters because at this speed, the car to the first 50 has already happened. I've already made those decisions, and you've only got to get the nose through anyway. If the trees hit the back on the way through, it doesn't really count, which is a really interesting parallel analogy to exactly what you're talking about, right? The rate, you said that really interesting thing. We're living in, I'll just get you to repeat that because I think it's a pretty important insight for people to grab onto.
Yeah, so experiencing change at the fastest rate that we've ever had in human history, but then it will be the slowest that we'll experience for the rest of our lives.
Yeah. So, strategic planning of the past was linear, and the planning for the future cannot be linear
Exactly,
because
yeah.
so much will happen so quickly. So, accredited futurist.
Yeah.
That's not a career you would have woken up, one day in school and gone, "This is what I'm going to be. I'm going to be an accredited futurist."
No, like it's still one of those things that sort of when you kind of like you're talking to someone at the pub and then they say, "What do you do?" And then I go, "Oh, do I say futurist?" Because it either sounds a little bit naff or they won't know what it is. So look, so a futurist is sort of to what I spoke about earlier. We really pay attention to what are the trends that are happening today. What does that mean for the future? And then working with organizations to understand, well, what are the impacts, whether it's around the services that you might provide, whether or not you need to change your operating model for whatever reason, or whether it's around your workforce, so a range of different things there. But in terms of sort of how I became one, I guess. So I started out working in organizational strategy and then specialized in workforce strategy. So what's the kind of workforce that organizations need in the next 3 to 5 years and workforce planning? And then that kind of morphed into this space of the future of work, because increasingly what I was finding was when we're talking about the amount of people that we might need in 3 years' time, well, that has implications around property and the kind of office accommodation we'll need. Or when we're rolling out automation and artificial intelligence, well, that might have an impact on the amount of people we need and who's doing the work. And so it sort of started to become much more horizontal, that we needed to be collaborating across boundaries. Organizations weren't doing it, and I could sort of speak the language and play that role. And so that's kind of where I moved there. And then my COVID project was I wanted to think bigger and broader, because again, I started to go, well, we're seeing climate change have really big implications around work. Like if you go to 2030 and we look forwards there, 2.2% of working hours worldwide will be lost to climate change, which is the equivalent of 80 million jobs. And so, what are the impacts of climate change? What's the impact on sort of the changes we're seeing around consumers? So, consumers putting pressure on Woolworths to not stock Australia Day merchandise. And then that sort of flows into the social agenda in the organization. So that's kind of where I wanted and why I wanted to go even broader. So I did some study online because it was COVID and lockdown. So with the Institute for the Future in America, you can kind of then go through an accreditation process with the Futures School, which is a little bit like a light version of doing your, chartered accountancy. It's still very much a profession that's in its infancy. So the ambitions there, it's still sort of one of those things that's evolving. But with sort of ticking enough boxes, you then get admitted into this association of professional futurists, which are people like me who so you have to be sort of admitted as a member, but who operate and practice in and do this stuff day in, day out. So that's kind of a long way of answering how you get there.
I think it's useful for business leaders particularly to know that there are people out there who do this, as opposed to people who, Google some stuff and kind of form their opinion. I'd love you to speak to, because you've used the term a couple of times now, and in the context of business decisions and business leaders, I'd love you to speak to the idea of trends as a way of peering into the future, as opposed to, specific instances or special cause variations, or if we think statistics. I'm guessing that trends are kind of more important to you than specific instances and things like that. But often we react to the incident.
Yeah. So if I think about sort of the way that if I get all technical, so we would look at what's called a signal of change. So that's kind of a fancy way of saying trend, I guess. And so a signal of change is an indication of something that is different to today. That's kind of all. It's an indication that something could be different. And so what we do is, as we throw that into the future, I kind of said earlier about, is that the kind of future we want or not? We ask, who are the winners and who are the losers in this kind of scenario? What would life be like, or what would work be like if this was to be more common? And so when I'm sort of, consuming content, which is a large part of what I do, and I don't mean, well, sometimes it's going on TikTok, but not always. Sometimes it's going on online forums on Reddit. Sometimes it's just listening to podcasts and reading the news. But anytime when you kind of see a headline or read something or listen to something and you go, huh, it's highly likely that that's a signal of change. Something that kind of piques your attention. And so if I think about something that's happening really recent, like in terms of global politics, like there's a really interesting thing playing out where, we saw, I'll kind of go, I won't tap into elections because I think, I'm going to start, I don't want to get divisive. But what we've seen is post-COVID, we've seen a lot of countries start to focus on this idea of nationalism. So this idea of, what happens if the borders close and how vulnerable is our economy? So let's focus on protecting ourselves first as far as industry is concerned. Let's grow and make our own. Let's not be so dependent on migration. Let's not be so dependent on overseas trade and exports. Let's really try and focus on that sort of nationalistic agenda. And so that's a signal of change where I go, okay, if you throw that 10 years into the future, what does that look like? You then started to see globally a swing to the right, but then all of a sudden the Tories and in the French election, they started to get back to the left. And so they're the things that you play out as one example when I talk politics specifically. But as I said, it could be climate change, it could be food, it could be healthcare, anything sort of where we play and where we sort of gravitate towards.
Sure. And, where I think a lot of people are deep into the technology changes that are occurring at the moment with AI and so many other aspects of technology. But, I suspect from a, future viewing perspective, there are a lot of other kind of domains of interest other than just technology. I'd love you to map out, the 3 to 5 big chunks of, context. Technology, let's say, is one of them. What's going to happen with technology in the future? You've spoken about the world of work. Are there any major chunks that you tend to keep an eye on, more often than others in terms of mapping the future?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think technology, when you say that, like there is so much that underpins that, right? And so with wanting to sort of at least do that justice, when we say technology, it's also not just artificial intelligence, which is, I think, what we're all focusing on at the moment. We're seeing a massive rise in the metaverse as one example. So, the metaverse today is valued at $180 billion. By 2030, that could be worth about $10 trillion, which is 7,000% growth and half the size of China's economy. So that is growing exponentially, and how people live, work, and play in the metaverse and what that means for leaders will be huge. So I think there's that, and there's virtual reality, there's 3D printing, I could go on, but technology is a really, really big bucket, and it is the biggest mega trend that we're looking at. In terms of the other ones, I mean, work, but that's more a byproduct of a lot of this stuff.
Yep.
And within work, though, it's flexibility is a really, really big theme. So if I go back to sort of talking about signals of change, in Australia, we've had things like the right to disconnect come through, which is trying to protect outside of work hours. We've had secure jobs, better pay, which makes flexible working a right for some workers. The ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, has put forward positions for workers to be able to take double leave at half pay. So flexibility in how you take leave, and then the 4-day work week. So like there's a big trend around flexibility within the workspace. Otherwise, I would say sort of it really is climate change, politics, or what I would say the geopolitics, which includes some of those conflicts like what's happening with the wars playing out. And then generations is a really, really big one. I mean, we have Gen Z who are becoming more and more prominent within Australia and the world actually over the next 2 years. depending on where you live, Gen Z will occupy about 20 to 25% of the labor market. And so organizations, but communities really need to be paying attention to this cohort, but they're going to influence and shape a lot of what our organizations and communities look like. And so I think that's, a really, really big focus and where I'm getting a lot of questions and interest at the moment as well.
Fascinating. So if we think about, let's dial in on leadership, as a concept. And, I'm really interested in the idea of stewardship-driven leadership. So, leadership that meets the responsibility of being good stewards of the authority and the resources that you've been given. What makes a leader? In reality, you're a leader when you're given authority and control over resources that the average person doesn't get. And so you have a responsibility to that in terms of how you use it and to make sure you use it well. So, and let's talk about leadership, and let's talk about how you see leadership maybe needing, let's stay in the technological space, the technology change space. And how do you see leadership needing to adapt or change, if at all, as technology trends continue to emerge? I mean, I don't think industrial age leadership is necessarily going to work in a 21st century hyper-connected, distributed workforce kind of world. What are some of the things you think we might see happening in the leadership space?
Yeah, so I mean, because of the technology that we have available to us, hybrid working is one of those things that is here to stay. So we've seen a lot around mandates. We have seen an uptick in office attendance, but some form of hybrid, even if that is just working 1 day a week from home for people in those office-based roles, is the new normal. And so that really shifts the dynamic of leadership. And so there was a study done by the Australian HR Institute, which found that only around 30% of organizations offer some kind of training to support leaders in how to lead and manage in hybrid. But what I find too often is that a lot of leaders pick up what they did face to face, put it online, and expect to do the same thing and get the same result, which absolutely just doesn't work. We need to fundamentally redesign processes, engagement, how we communicate with our teams, how we think about the operating rhythm, how we develop and steward culture. And so that's sort of one example that I'm seeing there. I think I spoke a little bit about, the metaverse, and we're seeing those emerging technologies come through as well. Leaders are going to have to learn more and have this willingness to sort of learn, unlearn, and relearn, which is a little bit different to what we've seen in the past. Like normally you could sort of learn something, go on a conference, once a year, top up your knowledge cup, and then just sort of build and build and build. But we can't afford to sort of get into that fixed mindset. And so, that adaptive mindset where you learn, unlearn, relearn is really, really critical. And then the one thing that I found really interesting was a story. I was talking to someone who's a Gen Xer only a few weeks ago, and she was saying to me, it's really interesting because when she entered the workforce, she would look up to the older generations, like your silent generation, your baby boomers, those in leadership roles. And that's, she went in there and she's like, I'm going to learn as much as I possibly can from you. Like, I'm so excited to soak up all of your knowledge. And then now she's in the position where she's kind of the leader, and she's like, I'm having to now go to my junior staff and say, can you teach me about ChatGPT and about AI? And she's like, I thought that I was going to be the person that would know everything. And all of a sudden I'm not. And it's this very uncomfortable position, she described it as. And I think that's something that is really going to be a little bit different, is that as a leader, you're not going to be the smartest person in the room. You might technically have the most authority purely as a positional sort of flex, but you're not going to know everything. And so there's a real level of vulnerability that comes with that as well, particularly when it's such a marked change to what we've seen in the past.
Well, you're talking about a fundamental change. When you talk about learn, unlearn, and relearn, you're talking about a fundamental change. A long time ago in my past, I was a teacher, and and lectured at university and things like that. And the whole education was predicated on stacked knowledge. So you learn a foundation, then you learn the next bit and the extensions.
Yeah.
Stacked knowledge. Now that meant you had to hold on to everything you'd learned underneath, right? And then technology hit and the digital world hit, and Google came and everything shifted. You no longer needed to remember everything because you could get it like this. And so, we stepped into a world of adaptive knowledge. And I think one of the real differences between, say, a leader and a steward, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Leaders were taught they had to have all the answers.
Yeah.
And great stewards actually just have a way of finding out what the problem is. And they don't need to have the answer. They just want to know we're working on the right problem. And it's often the problem underneath the problem. It's never the first one that you actually come across, which is, what I think that lady was talking about, that leader was talking about. It's just, it's her job to go and stand next to we interviewed retired Major General Gus McLaughlin, and he said one of the responsibilities when you're a senior military leader is to go and stand next to the biggest problem and get it resolved, right? That doesn't mean you have to have the answers to it, but you need to be willing to stand next to the biggest problem and get that resolved. What are some of the, so learn, unlearn, relearn. What are some of the qualities that leaders have displayed in the past that you think will still stand them in good stead going into the future? And what are some of the qualities that leaders might have to develop that they haven't typically needed in the past with the way the world of work is changing?
Yeah, I think look, I think authenticity is a really, really big one, particularly when it comes to Gen Z. And I think it's something that we can sort of use as a throwaway or as a buzz term. But as far as Gen Z is concerned, authenticity is their number one thing, radical self-expression. And if I think about what that looks like in terms of how Gen Z engage in a corporate environment, as an example, they're starting to pull away from LinkedIn because they don't see it as being an authentic medium, because people jump on there and they talk about how humbled and grateful they are for this amazing opportunity. And someone says, wow, Ben, they're so lucky to have you. What an asset to the organization. And Gen Z are just saying that is total BS. It's all fake. It's all sort of these niceties, this inauthentic small talk. And so they're pulling away from LinkedIn. Or when it comes to communications, we're seeing this in terms of how they engage online in social media. But in a corporate environment, they don't want a senior leader that sits in front of a camera, reads off an auto cue or a script, then has it go to corporate communications, that then has it polished up in full production value and gets sent out. Because as far as they're concerned, you're trying to manipulate them and you're trying to sell them on a message because it's been so heavily curated. And so this is where I'm getting at when I'm saying authenticity is critical. They would much rather that you pulled out your phone, just took it in one take. If you make a mistake, even better. They love that because it shows that you're being just the real version of you. And I think that's a big change for some people, because when I first started in the workforce, I was told that there was essentially your work persona and your personal at-home persona. And we've seen that sort of shift significantly, particularly with the focus on diversity and inclusion. But I think that there's still this level of discomfort with some more tenured leaders around, no, well, I can't say that, or I can't be like that because these are the people that work for me. And I don't want to, I've got to be careful what I project and what I say and what I don't say. And so I think that's sort of a lever that needs to be sort of pulled, but some are a little bit reluctant still. I think another one goes back to what we were talking about, Simon, around leaders who feel like they need to know all the answers. I think the sign of the most successful leader is that your team can operate smoothly without you. And that means that you have to be comfortable to be outshone by others. And so I've always said, if you feel like you can't leave your organization because for a week or two, if you went on leave, they wouldn't function, you haven't done your job as a leader. You've poorly trained up the people underneath you. You need to let yourself be outshone by others and check your ego at the door. And that's not a criticism necessarily of leaders, because that's just the system that, we've grown up in, that we've reinforced that, about power and ego and everything and those sorts of dynamics. So I think that's another really interesting one. I think there's this piece around still needing to take on the tough challenges. One thing, we were talking about this before we started recording, which is around some of the criticisms that come of Gen Z and younger generations. They like to be wrapped in cotton wool, those things that you often hear people say. And yet I've felt that in the environment that we're in, leaders are so reluctant to have a difficult conversation with people. And part of that, don't get me wrong, is that there's this level of concern or worry that in the regulatory environment, well, what if you take me to Fair Work, or what if I say the wrong thing and then I'm liable and I don't know sort of what I can and can't do. But you take, going back to that example of sort of working from home, a lot of the mandates, the rationale behind it is, well, you're not productive working at home. That's not a working from home issue. That's a performance management issue.
Yeah.
And so instead, you're avoiding having the conversation about performance and then forcing them and everyone else back into the office. So again, I think there's that. But then things that I'm already seeing that are happening and are just going to dial up, like collaboration is going to be so critical. Collaborating with your team and really asking them and talking to them about what they want, what their expectations are. It's not command and control, but we've been seeing a shift away from that for a while. And it's just that that's going to dial up, and also collaboration across your silos in the organization as well. So working with all of those different stakeholders. And then, the role as leaders, as coaches, we spoke about this as well. You've already touched on it around, as a leader, how do you provide feedback? How do you mentor? How do you remove barriers for people? Stand next to those sort of big problems, like you said. And then also how you go about role modeling diversity, flexibility, those kinds of things. I think still not underestimating the way that particularly junior staff members see you. And it's really important that you're role modeling a lot of this change that we want to see in the workplace.
I was going to ask you a question about how you see leaders of the future, still retaining the humanity of the organization in the midst of AI and the rise of automations and technology. I feel like you've just kind of laid that out already.
Yeah, I think that the other things, though, sort of when you say, how do you retain the humanity? I think it's really important to remember that as more and more goes online, the value of what makes us uniquely human gets amplified. And so any of the studies you see around what are the skills of the future and all of that stuff, it all comes back to our human skills. And so it's really thinking about how do you develop those, whether that's through formal or informal learning. A lot of the time that actually does come down to leaders, because you can't just necessarily send someone on a course and then, after half a day, they're certified in emotional intelligence. Like that takes frequent point in time feedback from leaders and having those kinds of conversations, getting to know your team members as people, not in a transactional sense, but really in a deeper relational sense. That's the kind of stuff around how we retain humanity. And I think the other thing that I've seen really pleasingly with some leaders is, just because you can adopt technology, it doesn't mean that you should. And having those kinds of conversations, that means the leader, the CEO, or the leader that sits outside of the IT function needs to have a seat at the table talking about it, because too often do I see IT functions kind of get thrown the, automation and AI agenda because it's techie, but they're really good at the how. They're not good at the why. They're not talking about, why are we doing this? What's going to be the impact on job role, purpose, meaning, value, culture? And that's where leaders need to be part of that conversation. And there was one CEO that I was talking to, this is now about 2 years ago, and he said he had an opportunity to automate the entire call center within his organization. So we're talking like over 100 staff. But he said he didn't do it because he found that the most effective middle managers he had came from the call center environment, because they understood the customers. They were at the front line. They had sales experience. It was a really critical breeding ground as far as succession was concerned. And so while it would have saved them money, he felt that he actually just couldn't go about and automate that. And that to me was also one of those examples of, let's still focus on what makes us special. Let's still focus on our people and retain what makes us human.
And, it probably protected him in the marketplace. If you, book an international trip through an automated online service and you turn up in Europe somewhere at 2 o'clock in the morning and your booking isn't at the hotel, you want to get on the phone and talk to a human. You don't want to get into a chat bot and go, help me with this thing.
This is very real for me, and I'm not going to say the company, but I've ordered a pair of shoes, and let me tell you, dealing with bots, and they're telling me it's at the post office, and the post office is telling me that they've never seen it, and I can't talk to a human. It is so frustrating.
Correct.
So frustrating.
Because humans turn to other humans when they have a problem that they need to have solved. And, in an increasingly digital world, humans are still analog. We have a range of emotions, and we have ranges and levels of knowledge, and we're consoled by another person, not by technology. And so absolutely technology has to be in business these days. But I think one of the really important reasons for doing many of the things that you're talking about as a leader to retain the human touch inside the organization, if you like, is, your market will probably, protect you further for a longer period of time if they can actually talk to a human. I'm hearing that all the time. People saying, I just want to talk to a person.
Yeah.
And, when I ring up, it's interesting. I've got a question where I'm going to ask you to step forward 10 years, and then I want to come back to, any kind of thoughts you have around some of the ethical dilemmas around the future of work, with the rise of AI and technology and displacement of jobs and things like that. But the question to project you forward into the future, you're working as a futurist 10 years ago, and you were saying to a manager at that time, let me paint what the world will be like in 10 years from now. We're just going to do one big jump to what the world will be like in 10 years from now. They couldn't have imagined it. We would have had COVID in between, the shift from everyone at the workplace to distributed workforces and work from home.
Yeah.
Let's play that game from now. You're talking to a manager today. Well, you're a futurist. This is let's play that game. Imagine you're talking to a manager today, and you're saying to them, I'm just going to give you one big jump to 10 years from now and just raise possibilities. So, Ben, the rules are simple. You don't actually have to be right. It's just some of the things you think could happen because we kind of want to blow their mind a little bit, raise their awareness. So it'll come from out of some of the trends you're seeing. But let me tell you what 10 years from now could look like for you as a leader, as a business leader. And what kind of things would you be talking to them about?
Wow. Okay. I like the fact that I can't be held accountable for this. So I'll roll
Well,
with
that wouldn't be
it.
fair.
So I think I'm just going to riff off the top of my head. I
Sure.
think going back to that whole thing around climate change, I think depending on where you live, there will be some countries, some cities where the core working day will get changed from 9 to 5 to 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. because we're going to try and escape the extreme heat in the middle of the day.
Yep.
If I go back to Spain last year in the Spanish summer, they actually banned some kinds of outdoor work from happening altogether if there was an orange or a red heat rating. So construction, horticulture, that kind of stuff. So they're already starting those conversations now. So it wouldn't be inconceivable that in 10 years' time, we don't work 9 to 5, we work 6 to 2, but then that impacts the school system when grocery stores are open, all that stuff. I think we will definitely see organizations have offices in the metaverse, their clients will be in the metaverse, their employees will be working in the metaverse as well, which will throw a completely different dimension literally onto the landscape around leadership. And with that, I think we'll start to see more around spatial computing. So I'm not sure if you've seen Apple's latest VR headset that they've released, but basically you put it on and your computer screen, your keyboard, everything sort of comes up as a hologram. And so in that sense, you won't necessarily need a laptop, you won't need a fixed workstation. Wherever you put your headset on, you can work, you can be at your computer, you can be in virtual meetings, all of that sort of stuff. So I think that will have really significant changes around the dynamics of where and how we work. And then maybe a couple more. I think that we're going to see less big corporates and we're going to see more smaller, innovative, nimble organizations, not necessarily startups, but this sort of, from the 80s Wolf of Wall Street, corporate is king kind of, approach to capitalism. I think that's sort of starting to dissipate, particularly with those younger generations and that focus on connection to purpose and impact. And I think we'll see more gig workers, a lot more gig workers as well. So I think we could get to a point, say if you want to be provocative about it, in 10 years' time, where more workers will be gig workers than employed workers. And by that, I mean sole traders, contractors working, doing a few days a week here, a few days a week there, or a contract there and then a contract there. I think we'll get to a point where we have more of those gig workers rather than people who are employed directly working for us. And as one example, this was pre-pandemic, so this would have probably changed, but Google had more sort of temporary workers than permanent workers. And so if you look at it there, it's, you know, a really interesting case study. Again, what happens if that plays out 10 years down the track? I think there's a high likelihood.
And it has a massive social implication for people. And have you read Salim Ismail's the Exponential Organization? Fascinating
No.
book. And he talks about the three qualities of the exponential organization. And one of them is a fundamental shift to the way we organize people and the organization itself. And a lot of it is about this, you know, the self-employed business within the business, you know, the individual doing gig work, and, you know, quite a fascinating read. Let's come back to, you know, the rise of AI, particularly as a technological front. And, you know, people, I'm not talking about whether AI is the greatest existential threat to humanity that's ever been invented. I think that's for other people to debate. And, you know, climate change might get us before AI does, if we're not better at that. But I am talking about AI in terms of displacement of jobs, but at the same time, it creates jobs. You know, so technology often shifts the line at which human labor is valued. But, you know, I'd love to kind of explore any of the ethical issues you're seeing as a result of your focus on, you know, the nature of work and the future of work that's specifically coming through with AI. Any conversations that you're sitting in and around that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of conversations I'm having around the ethical use of AI, not even the use necessarily, but also the design of it. So, you know, we still don't know necessarily, you know, where the data is going, because the way that these tools become sophisticated, they learn from the data that you put in. And so when we put in data, where does it go? So around privacy and security, you know, really big question marks. In terms of who's designing this tech as well, we have no visibility of the people who are actually behind the keyboard making it happen. And the reason why that's important is if you go over to the US, when you look at the likes of autonomous vehicles, so when they first designed prototypes and put them into a test environment, they found that the cars would run into black people at nighttime. And the reason was because there was a bunch of white folk who developed the technology and just hadn't thought about it. You know, you also go to the US judicial system, they deployed AI and found that the AI had a prejudice by saying that black people or African Americans were much more likely to reoffend than Caucasian or Europeans. And so again, there's these ethics that come back to, well, who's designing this technology and how do we make sure it's then used in the right way? In terms of usage, a lot of stuff coming from the education sector, who are really concerned about how do you teach students critical skills when, you know, there's a proportion of them that are still using AI and then copy and pasting from ChatGPT, say their essay or their assignment. Yeah. And how do they get on top of that? So they're actively trying to solve for that. And I have conversations with them around that as well. I think there's then this piece around the divide that can then emerge as well. And to be fair, I think a lot of this technology is freely available on the market. It's not like, you know, you can't afford ChatGPT and therefore you don't have access to generative AI, because you can get free versions of it. The payments are based on basically volume and how much you use it. Caveat on that, you know, it might be that at some point in time they will start charging, and maybe it's free now because they need us to use it so it can get smarter. Don't know. But at this point in time, it's sort of tied back to that piece around those who have access to the internet versus those that don't, or those that have access to those opportunities to reskill and upskill and develop those AI capabilities. But yeah, there will be some jobs that get displaced. I don't buy into some of the sensationalist headlines that the robots are coming to take our jobs and there's going to be, you know, really large numbers of people that won't be employed anymore. The vast majority of roles will still exist in 10 years' time. They will just look some incredibly different, some marginally different, but 100% of them will have been impacted by AI in some capacity. And I found it really interesting, a study, it was the Microsoft Work Trends Index from a couple of months ago. And there was findings that said that over 70% of hiring managers have said that they would hire someone that was less experienced and less qualified, but had skills in AI over someone more qualified, more experienced, but not good at AI. And so that's where sort of, the world's going, and that's where we really need to lean into it. But obviously that's where a divide can emerge from an ethical perspective, like you mentioned.
Well, a couple of interesting things that you highlighted, the risk of losing critical decision making. And ethical and moral debates come from a critical discussion. And you're an academic, you spend a lot of time on campus. There was, once upon a time, university was about, critical dialogue and debate. And, is it this or is it that? And that trained the skills of looking from multiple perspectives. And I don't know how accurate this is, but I did read an article, I think a couple of weeks ago, that said they think that by 2025 or 2026, all the human-generated content will have been consumed by AI for the large language models. So where does the new stuff come from, right? And I'm not sure that AI producing the content for AI is the smartest thing that we've got. That transparency of how's it being built and generated is kind of pretty important. No doubt we're in a brave new world, and things will continue to change. What is the advice you would give people? You either look forward to the future, with a frame of thinking that says it's coming and I'm going to be a part of it, or you look forward to the future saying it's coming and it scares the hell out of me. And one of those will serve you and one of those won't. And so how would you equip people? What's the thought that you would leave people with? And then I'd like to ask you 2 or 3 quick questions so we can know a bit more about Ben. But what thought would you leave with people to say, like, the future is going to happen. Time always wins. Like, the future comes. So, here's one way of thinking about it. Here's one way of positioning yourself so that you do head into the future with a frame of kind of possibility and optimism.
Look, I think for me personally, I'm very optimistic about what the future looks like. I think there's a lot of negativity out there, and the media that we consume is aptly amplifying that because, the news outlets need advertising dollars. We know that to get advertising dollars, you need our attention, and neurologically, our brains pay more attention to the bad stuff than the good stuff. We spend 2/3 of our neurons looking out for bad news and just 1/3 for good news. So we have this predisposition for it. So I get why people feel a little bit negative about the future. I personally believe that it's something to look forward to. And, very quick shameless plug, I have a podcast called Thinkertank, and then an Instagram called Thinkertank.lab. Both of them where I curate and post trends that lean into that idea about hope and optimism. But in terms of some things that you can do to kind of develop your futures literacy and whatnot, the number one thing you can do is talk to teenagers. They are your insight into the future. It's the easiest thing you can do. I often say to parents who have teenage children, next time they're on their phone, don't yell at them for being on their phone or tell them to get off. Ask them, what apps are you using? What platform are you on? Why do you like text messaging and why won't you answer my phone? With what's happening in America, what do you think about the political landscape over there? We're going to have an election in Australia early next year. Who would you vote for and why? Have conversations with them about how they see the world and how they engage with it, because that's your window into what it looks like. I think another thing for me that's helped in terms of mindset is you should be using generative AI every single day in your job, particularly if you work behind a desk, even as sort of a leader who's predominantly in meetings and maybe not necessarily churning out the work as much. You should be using it every single day. And in fact, the loudest critics in organizations who are critical of AI and not the ones using it.
Not using
And
it.
so that's where it's really important to use it. And what I do is I have like a to-do list, or I look at what I have to do first thing in the morning for the day or on a Monday for the week ahead. And I essentially just go, if I had my own intern working for me, what work would I get my intern to do? And whatever work you would get your intern to do, 100% of that can be done by AI. And so that's how you kind of build that muscle of going, all right, it's more than just writing an email. It's more than just, writing a report, whatever it might be. Anything you would get your intern to do, get AI to do it for you. And it goes back to that sort of point as well. Would you get your intern to write a report and then without even looking at it, just copy and paste it and publish it online? No, they would kind of get it about 70% of the way. And then you would need to add, subtract, make sure it's in the right tone. That critical thinking you were talking about is going to lack that. And so you're going to want to overlay that yourself and overlay your wisdom and experience. And so that's kind of the mentality I get in when I'm thinking about how I can use it more and more. And it's such a game changer. And whether or not you want it to be a game changer, it will be. And so I really just encourage people to lean into it.
Yeah. So, exercise, the future focused mental muscles basically, and get the tools in play. Couple of quick questions, just off the cuff, fast answers.
Okay.
If you could have invented anything, so you're a futurist, you look forward, but if you could have invented anything, what would you have loved to have invented and why?
Quick answer, electricity. Because it to me, it's kind of like where AI is right now. Like it came along, it disrupted us, it transformed entire industries, new industries came along, and now we can't imagine life without it. I think that's where we'll get to, in 20, 30 years' time when we look back at artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Where are you spending most of your reading time right now?
I consume a lot of content on Instagram, TikTok Reels, online forums, and podcasts.
Yep.
I think sort of as like so it's really varied, and it's intentionally varied because I don't want to get stuck in a vacuum or just hear from one particular perspective. But like one sort of really quick and easy thing that you guys can do. I listen to the Squiz podcast, and there's a couple of other ones like the Briefing or the Daily Oz, less than 10 minutes. And so I listen to that on my commute or when I'm going for a
Yep.
walk. Listen to that every single day. So you don't have to read the news. You don't have to go online. It's just in your ears, a short summary of the key headlines you need to be across, and it's super useful.
Perfect. And I'm going to modify this question from how I normally ask it. So if you could kind of be in the mind of a historical figure who did something significant, but because of how it played out into the future, who would that historical figure be?
And this is where I can be a cop out and be like, I'm not a historian, I'm a futurist. I think look, I'm not one of these people that get so set on like, even like when you say who's your dinner party guest, I don't have dinner party guests, or like I don't have a celebrity that I'm like super into. I love those sort of what if scenarios. One, I want to see, it's not historical, but it's now, but I want to see how it plays out in the future is what the Matildas moment for the World Cup did for women's sport. I think that in Australia, that was such an iconic shift. And so it's not a person, but it's a group and it's a movement. And it wasn't just intentional. It was a campaign that was 3 to 4 years in the making that led to that one moment. And I want to see what does that do for women's sport and participation right through to grassroots sort of in the next 10 to 20 years. So,
that services the answer. I mean, they went into that World Cup with an intention, which was to put women's soccer on the map. They would love to have won it, but it was a home World Cup and they went into it with that intention. We're seeing that playing out in the WNBA in the US right now with Caitlin Clark, who's just lighting up women's basketball. It'd be interesting to see 5 years down the track, will she become the Larry Bird, and what was she thinking in this period of time at 22 years of age?
and I think like from a generational perspective, right? Because you look at playgrounds, and there are boys who are playing soccer that are saying, you know, I want to be Caitlin Ford, or
Yeah.
I want to be, you know, this particular player. Or I've even heard one of them say, the Socceroos, is that like the male Matildas team? And
And
you
they're
know,
buying
it's
they're
the
buying the
inversion,
Matilda.
and I think it's great.
Yeah, they're buying the Matildas Guernseys, and
Yeah.
things like that. It's pretty fascinating. Ben, it's been fantastic being able to talk about future trends with you. But it isn't really about future trends because the future is here. It always is. And the big learning out of this for me is people really need to be aware. You can't bury your head in the sand and imagine the future is not going to come. My challenge to leaders, if you want to be a great steward of resources and the things you have a responsibility for, you just cannot bury your head in the sand. You need to be, looking forward at what's going to happen. You need to tap into people like yourself, Ben, who are doing this all the time, trying to figure out what the trends are and where it is headed, and make critically kind of considered decisions. But what we can't do is bury our heads in the sand. The future is always here now, and it's always coming. So we get to look forward to it and be a part of it, or you get to run away from it. But the fact is, it always still comes. It always still arrives. So thank you so much for sharing so many insights with us. I really, really appreciate that. And I hope, as a leader, if you're listening, you explore further. We'll have the ability to connect with Ben's shows and things like that. And I think people need to start to monitor some of the content that's going to prepare them for the future. So thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks, Simon.